every newspaper from the beginning of the history of this county in the file up to 1994. So it took quite a few years and had a lot of help. Dr. Cleon Swayze from Columbia University, Dr. Harvey Carter of Colorado, both Forest residents, and the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. I guess we'll just do an overview. You know, when you're doing history, there's a lot of stories. And of course, the first story that always is associated with Forest, Indiana, is the Miami treasure. Now, some of you may have heard about this, some may not. Anyway, Forest and Johnson Township were part of the Miami Reserve. It was the last land given up by the Miami Indians here in Indiana. And, of course, Miami were removed in 1847. But one of their leaders, Chief Richardsville, which one of our local towns over in Howard County, Brucheville, is named for. Now you say, how did it get Brucheville or Brucheville from Richardsville? But Richardsville was half Miami, half French. So in French, Brucheville. So yeah, a typical Hoosierism. Not saying we don't know how to spell, but we turned Richardsville into Russiaville somehow. And anyway, after the last purchase, he received for the Miami Indians about $117,000 in gold. That Richardsville he was up with the modern world, and he did trade in some bonds, and he did invest, but the Miami never saw that. And the legend is that he had 3 boxes built of black walnut. They were oiled. The boxes were about this large. Okay, and he hid them in 3 places on the old Miami Reserve. One was discovered near Fort Wayne during some of the reconstruction of the fort up there, and they did find it. It was empty. Okay. 2 others were somewhere. Now the legend is that supposedly one of these was in Forest Township, along the banks of Swamp Creek, and nobody would have given it any thought except in 1876, 2 wagon loads of Miami who had been removed to Oklahoma came back to Forest Township, to the farm of Andrew Wyrick. And the oldest of them, of course, asked Mr. Wyrick, said he wanted to know where an old black walnut tree stood that had markings on it. Well, he knew the tree. He said, yeah, but I'm sorry, we cut it down and used it for a beam for this barn. Okay? And he said, well, there's a huge rock that's got markings on it. He said, can you tell me where that's at? He goes, yeah, it's under the barn there. We used it for, 1 3/4 of the barn. So he asked for a lantern, and he crawled under the barn, dug out, crawled under, and unfortunately, the markings were face down. So the Miami, both wagon loads, a little discouraged, and a lot discouraged, got back in their wagon and headed back to Oklahoma. And that's the Miami treasure. Now, Mr. Wyrick did receive a lot of good-natured teasing from his neighbors, because him and some of his descendants used to, when they plowed, they just kind of dropped that plow as deep as they could in those fields, hoping to turn something up. But that just kind of led to exhausted horses, and who knows where it's at. The tree's gone. The rock has been uncovered within the last couple of years. It does have markings on it, but nobody knows what they mean. So that's the story of the Miami treasure.
Who's Andy Wyrick? How did his friend Wyrick?
The Jephthah's father or grandfather, I think.
Bill Wyrick.
Lawrence and all of them are descended. Yeah. Okay, so the first settlers in Forest Township was not what you would think. You know, when you talk about pioneers and people coming, you always think of guys like Daniel Boone, you know, big, strong, but that's not the way Forest began. There was an older gentleman by the name of Thomas Nutter, who was 69, and his son, Joseph, who was 12 at the time, in the spring of 1839. They left Harrison County, Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia, due to the 1837 economic depression. And things weren't going too well there. They somehow managed to get down the Ohio River to Madison and then took the Michigan Road north. This was, you know, since Forest was one of the last areas of the state opened up for settlement or for being able to purchase it because of the Miami, well, it was open ground. So he took a chance. Him and Joseph built a lean-to. They stayed there through the spring and the summer, and then in the fall, the rest of the family joined them. And so the settlement of Forest began in 1839, much later than the rest of Clinton County. You know, by 1839, Frankfort was booming, and most of the rest of the county was really going, but Forest was not. Basic statistics. First marriage, 1840, John Nutter, who was a son of Thomas, married Susanna Burroughs, and of course Joseph Nutter died in 1843, at the age of 73, and of course the closest cemetery at that time was Lehman, which was over on the Michigan Road. That's how woolly everything was. I'm trying to fit in everything within an hour, so we'll see if this works, okay? Then the next one would have been Paige Sims, the Sims family, which had a tremendous impact on the history of Forest, and then when the family moved in mass to Frankfort, had a huge impact on the development of the city of Frankfort. Both, you know, this was a very distinguished family. And I'm not sure if there's any descendants left, not that I know of. The last I knew of was Mary Rogers. So, anyway, Sims was a very respected citizen, stayed on his frontier farm, and parts of his log cabin is still inside of a dwelling out there in Forest Township. And of course, after the pioneer years, you get into the Civil War. I put these names up, it's only appropriate. These are the names of the young men from Forest Township that lost their lives in the Civil War. Nothing has probably affected this county more than that time period. If you look back and you look at the history of Clinton County, the Civil War years were very traumatic. It had to be. Everybody knew someone or was probably related to someone who died in the service of their country. So that could not have been easy. Speaking of the Sims, going back of the six brothers, okay, there were six brothers from Forest and Warren Township. They were right there on the boundary area, basically between Middle Fork and Rushville, that served in the Civil War. And one, James Noble Sims, was a captain, teacher, lawyer, soldier, really statesman, one of the founders of the National and the Indiana Republican Party. And that's a name that probably should be remembered. And if you look back, you'll notice on Sims, David Sims, James Sims, William Sims, they paid a heavy price. Their family gave all. William P. Milligan, there's a name most people don't hear too often. I had the honor and the privilege of looking through his Civil War diaries. He was a member of Company G, the 89th Indiana. He lived out near Burgess Corner, which is Johnson Township. That was the place to be before there was Circleville or Forest. Okay. Burgess Corner was where it was at. Anyway, he was shot in the head and left for dead on the battlefield at Fort DeRussy in Louisiana. As they were preparing to bury him, they noticed he started moving. He laid in a coma for 3 months, and 6 months later, he was back at the front with his unit, which is a good thing. He became quite a distinguished citizen in both Clinton, Tipton, and Howard counties. He became a teacher and eventually a superintendent in Howard County, and did a lot of work for veterans, helping them get pensions, helping them get education. Very distinguished gentleman. And good old John Finney. All right, well, all of us take different routes in this life, and this gentleman really did. John's buried out St. Paul. He was from Force. He went to the war. And John could be pretty rough. As a matter of fact, well, they said, and this is a story, well, they're all stories, okay? But anyway, he was inebriated, walking across a railroad trellis. When he fell off, he was captured by the Rebs, and 3 days later, they asked if they could trade him back. I mean, and the thought always was, why didn't they just shoot him? But they said, no, they didn't want to shoot him, but they wanted to trade him back. They didn't want him. And there's a lot of stories about John Finney, a lot. Probably one from the 1870s, him and another younger man by the name of Albert Dennis. There was a, how to put it, they called it in the papers a Dutch tramp. Basically a hobo, somebody down on their luck. But anyway, this person had made a pass at one of the local girls. Well, that didn't fare well with Finney. Finney wasn't going to tolerate that. Nobody's going to come into his town and harass one of the young ladies. So they tarred and feathered him and threw him in an outgoing boxcar. We have no idea what happened to the guy, but he probably was wishing he never ran into John Finney. John Finney's last wish before he passed from this earthly plane was that all his friends would come out the day of his burial, and they would spend the night sitting there drinking whiskey, which he had done quite a bit of, breaking the bottles against the stone and saying, oh, John Finney, you're gone but not forgotten. We did some archaeology work this past year and didn't find any whiskey bottles around the tombstone, so I'm not sure about the validity of that story. William Archer. Craig Dunn, who is an insurance agent, has done a lot of Civil War history out of Howard County, wrote quite a bit on William Archer. Some of his letters are extant and belong to a local family. Probably one of the roughest, crudest, uneducated, and determined men to serve in Mr. Lincoln's army. No question about that. If you read his letters, you would understand. Most of his focus was on killing Rebs, which most soldiers didn't talk about. That and his discussions with other young men around Forest and Brishaville, that whole area, about the virtues of some young ladies and how some were virtuous and some were not, and things like that, and also how the crops were. He made it through the war. He also had the distinction of being in an elite group of United States sharpshooters and had risen to the rank of Master Sergeant. He was a leader of men, even though he was, like I said, uneducated, crude, and rough, but he was the right kind of man to have in a fight. Unfortunately, on the last day of the Battle of Spotsylvania courthouse, as Grant was pressing Lee towards the final surrender, he was shot. As he came up, he led the way up over the trenches and unfortunately was shot and killed in the frontal attack there. So he never got to come back to Force. Oh, angels? Okay. Basically, the frontier era in Force Township ended between 1865 and 1882. The focal point before Forest became a town was Mortonsville. It was a small town that was about 1 mile east and 1 mile south, 1/2 mile east. There was a village there. And it was a pretty distinguished village. It had quite a few occupants. The post office was run by Martin Davis, a name that's still prominent in the area. There was the Little Flock Baptist Church, a school, an excellent school actually, taught by John Oliphant, a sawmill run by Nathan Orr, the Carrick brothers, who were related to the Bracken family. All right. They came from England, were wagon makers and blacksmiths, and then of course there was Doc Gentry, good old Doc Wade Gentry. He was the first physician in our area. Doc Gentry had a long, long history. He was a 49er. He went to California. He didn't find gold. One of his brothers was a doctor here in Frankfort, and one was at Colfax. So he was from a long line of medicine men. He was the main physician at the Battle of Missionary Ridge during the Civil War. So he had seen a lot, done a lot. He liked his log cabin. He liked Mortonsville. And when the town of Forest was built, he refused to move there because he wanted nothing to do with trains or new clapboard houses. He didn't want to come into the modern 19th century. Doc liked things just the way they were. And he was a very good man and a very good doctor, from everything I've read and everything I heard. In 1874, the town of Forest was laid out along the new Frankfort Kokomo Railroad, and it would replace Mortonsville, and it would become the focal point of what would become Forest Township in January of 1882. The first train, and I apologize for the quality of those two pictures, but anyway, the first train came through on March 28, 1874, and all this was due to the vision and the hard work of a attorney here in Frankfort with the name of Henry Y. Morse. Some of you may have known his grandson who bore the same name, and he could really tell a story. Okay, the first tickets were sold from a white oak stump in the street, which was about 8 foot across, native timber, and after the Co-Adams came, and after the railroad came, everything changed in Forest. Now, I'm always asked about this story, and it is true. Forest has a tendency, it had a dark side and a light side, I guess. It's kind of like duct tape. Okay, and particularly in the issue of temperance. There was drinking that went on in Forest, but there were those who fought back against it. And in April of 1886, the local tavern, some of the women decided they were tired of their men spending their money there, spending their time, and so they put a few sticks of dynamite under it. And as the local proprietor was walking towards the front door, the tavern went boom. Well, a few years later, another man with the name of Jarvis tried the same thing. Unfortunately for him, things didn't go so well either. They didn't blow it up, but what happened, Jarvis, on August 3rd, 1894, got drunk himself. Well, when he passed out, the locals figured, well, everything's free. And so they drank out his establishment, and the mob sort of poured into the street afterwards, or, yeah, kind of poured. They couldn't walk, and they called the local sheriff, but by the time the sheriff got on the train here in Frankfort and made it all the way out to Forest, most of them were already home sleeping it off. In the meantime, Jarvis was without any inventory, a huge amount of bills, and he just sort of vanished, slipped off for greener pastures, more less debt-ridden pastures, you might say. story of Amer Green. Amer Green was not one of our more notable or, well, pleasant individuals to ever live in this county. Or he also lived in Carroll County. He also lived in Howard County. He got around. In 1889, he was dating a young lady near Flora with the name of Luella Mabbitt. Well, her body was found in the Wildcat, and her clothing, soaked in blood, were hanging from a tree north of Forest. For years, the older residents, they told me, for years, people would not even drive by there after dark. They were a lot of people were very superstitious about that. Just north of Aunt Pat's house, that's where it was. Amer and his brother Bill, who was a hunchback, took off and were working on a ranch in Texas, when finally word was received by the Carroll County Sheriff. He made the journey down to Texas. They were arrested, brought back to the jail at Delphi. On the night of October the 29th, 1889, several residents of Forest, Richeville, Burlington, this guy was really popular, not in the right way either. They went to the jail at Delphi. The sheriff unlocked the front door and walked out the back. The crowd took him to a tree about 5 miles southeast of Delphi. And basically, there were some exchanges, there was some talk, and eventually somebody slapped the horses and buckboard, and they always referred to it as "Let Her Go Gallagher." And that became actually a phrase in Clinton County, in Carroll County, and here just in north central Indiana for many, many years. Some of you may have known older people that used the phrase, "Let her go Gallagher," which basically means, forget it, just whatever. The reason for that is, this was 1889 Indiana. This was not the Wild West. And there was an investigation from Indianapolis. There were two brothers by the name of Gallagher that ran stores in Burlington. And both were kind of meek, easy little guys. And so basically everybody knew that there's no way they could have been involved in this. But they were willing to have their name attached to it because the state would not believe they had any part of it. So that was part of the plan of the gentleman who performed this deed. And like I said, that became sort of a local phrase for a long time. Let her go Gallagher. The election of 1896. We've got to have politics in here. That's always fun. How many have heard of William Jennings Bryan? Okay, ran for president 3 times unsuccessfully, but he was very popular. He was a prairie statesman from Nebraska. He was an old farm boy himself, and the farmers loved him. As a matter of fact, I'll tell this story. There was a very distinguished gentleman in our community by the name of Carl Merrick. He'd been a county commissioner. He'd been a long-time Republican. As a matter of fact, he was very, very solid in his political beliefs. And I asked him one time, I said, "Did you ever vote for a Democrat?" And he said, "Yes, I did, 3 times. The same man." And he said, "If he was alive today, I'd vote for him again." And I said, "Well, that must be somebody special. Who was that?" He goes, "William Jennings Bryan." Okay, so this gentleman here, when he ran for president, he drew a lot of support in what was really a Republican majority county, to the point that the Republicans were sure this was going to cause them to lose whatever control they had here. And there were a lot of stories around this. October the 2nd, 1896, there was a big rally for his opponent, who was William McKinley, who became president, and the local Democratic precinct leader, who happened to be, go back a few slides, John Finney, of all people, had gotten a group together from Mercerville. And so with clubs and whatever else, they entered the Methodist Church, and it turned into just, did you know about this? Yeah, it turned into a fist fight, and the meeting broke up. So much for the rally for William McKinley. Okay. On election day in the town of Forest, it resulted in two gentlemen by the name of Polly and Fancier getting into a knife fight while they were standing in line waiting to vote. And 2 years later, to show what this had stirred up, in 1898, Forest Township had the distinction that the poll workers from both parties, they had brought an old soldier by the name of Abe Youngkin from the old soldiers' home over at Marion. They brought him in to vote, and when they went to do that, the Democrats said, no, we're not going to allow him to vote. He doesn't live here. And it resulted in a big fist fight. They knocked each other out. The sheriff was called from Frankfort. They all got fined, I think, $1 each. Okay. And then, of course, they had to replace all of them. And trying to run the election that day in 1898 wasn't too easy. Yeah. You notice they always had to call the sheriff down here, which usually was a good, probably half hour to hour to get him out there. So that was always a problem. Education. The good old one-room schoolhouses. I always loved the names of the ones in Forest Township. We had Possum Trot, Apes Island, which actually wasn't on an island. Probably in some of the areas you guys have lived, some of the other schools, Lake Skillet, Frogtown. What are some of the other ones here in Clinton County? Yeah. Yeah, Liberty was very popular over in Warren Township. I always liked it. Apes Island and Possum Trot, I just never envisioned a possum trot. Yeah. This gentleman, Mark Miller, was a longtime teacher, well-respected citizen in our area. In 1896, the township trustee, Gus Mendenhall, decided to build a high school, because once a student got to the 8th grade, that was it. Unless you moved to Frankfort, boarded in Frankfort, or were willing to take the train to Frankfort every day to attend high school here in the city. So, he decided Forest should have its own high school. The first day was January 7th, 1897, with 30 freshmen. His daughter, Grace, that's her graduation picture. Very pretty young lady. And Orphe Co. were the first graduates in April of 1900. By the way, she told me that dress was ordered from Italy. It was made of Venetian lace. And that's the way it looked in 1897. For those of you that saw the old high school, a little different. Yeah. And this is some of the students in 1904. What's kind of interesting, and this is interesting about Forest itself, it's produced some very distinguished and interesting people over the years. Roscoe Stoddard, some of you may have heard of him. I doubt any of you met him. I'm not sure if I can pick him out or not. Roscoe went on to become a marine biologist. The collection at Indiana University and the University of Chicago is mostly his work, particularly from the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And there was a gentleman who, in one of his books, mentions Roscoe as his mentor. The gentleman's name was Jacques Cousteau. So Clinton County went far and beyond. Also, you have the Oliphant family, the Swayzes. You have in this picture a future president. presidential advisor. You have all kinds of people that would go on and change the world. Now, this is forced, since we got the heavy rain just the other day, I thought, this is forced, this is the West End in 1913. 1913 March was the biggest flood in the history of Indiana. And God willing, we won't see anything like this again. As a matter of fact, I believe one of these gentlemen here is Doc Cherie, trying to make a call, trying to help somebody there in the West End of town. And of course, as you can tell, most of the forest was underwater in 1913. And just get into some pictures there. There's a local farmer. This is the way you used to get around 100 years ago, particularly in the wintertime. They say it wasn't so bad, but I always wondered about that, especially when it was like 28 below. Yeah. This is the construction of the Baptist church there in town in 1916. One of my counterparts and cousins over there, she probably recognizes most of these people, including her grandfather. And of course, we got Morris Polly, who was a descendant of the original settler of Forest Township right there. A sorghum camp. This is a sorghum camp, my great-great-grandfather, which was in Forest Township. Lincoln Stevens. Things were changing. His first family car in 1915. Okay. The 1912 Forest Bobcat baseball team. All right. Not bad. They played quite well and defeated Frankfort and Kokomo that season. So that was considered quite an honor for a town that really wasn't that big. And then, of course, like I said, things began to change. This was the Morrison Hotel. The Morrison family here in Frankfort, of course, like I said, they had a hotel, and they were instrumental and very closely tied to the town of Forest. And this particular, after the Morrison Hotel closed, it became a garage service area for Woody Goopler, whose son became a doctor here in Frankfort. Yes, Doc Goopler's. Yeah.
Where was that?
That would be near the railroad tracks. What's the best way of describing it?
By Kristen? Is that where Kristen was?
Where
Is that the one
Aunt
where-
Pearl lived.
Yes.
Pearl.
Oh, where they built Grandma's house, right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, right there on the south.
Yeah, that was a hotel. And then uptown, where Wally Stockburger lived, was a hotel also at one time. The first car was owned by a guy by the name of Albert Betts in 1909. And the first electric light was turned on by a local merchant, Clint Burns, in March of 2013. So, Forest was changing. And then we have George Obel. And, like I said, some of the stories I have maybe aren't so flattering, but this one is. This gentleman, actually, I always thought there should be a book written about this gentleman. You talk about a pioneer or somebody ahead of his time. He was. He started the first civic club in town. He purchased the first and sold the first radios. He edited he edited, printed, and did everything for the town's only newspaper. He sold the first tractors. He pushed for the electrification of the town. He took local businessmen that would get together and take trips to other towns that were doing quite well to observe how they were making progress, what things they were doing that was positive and making their town grow. And they brought those ideas back. Okay? And most of the older people I talked during the 20 years of research I did putting this together, most of them said usually their first toy or their first candy was from George Obel. It wasn't sold. It was just a present. Okay? And he was very well known for his generosity. But the most important thing is, and the reason I say he was a true pioneer, today we talk about the rights of the disabled. You notice that George Oppel did all this from a wheelchair, well over 100 years ago. Never complained, never thought that that was going to hold him back. And obviously, as you can tell by this, because he was involved in Clinton County politics and promoting, he was basically the Chamber of Commerce before there was a Chamber of Commerce. And like I said, the wheelchair never held him back. He had no regrets. The Great War, 1917 to 1919, the first ones drafted out of force were Ralph Bryant, Homer Robertson, Leslie Warden, and Basil Johnson. And then, of course, you had the blizzard of 1918. A lot of stories about that. They basically, each community in the county became totally isolated. Temperatures dropped to about 28 below. Drifts across the railroad were some places 10 to 15 feet deep. Everybody was isolated. And basically, this created a very negative situation in Clinton County. People who were of German or Irish descent were harassed. The Frankfort Times did not have one of its better moments when it printed the names of everybody who had not purchased war bonds on the front paper, paper. There became sort of a war hysteria in this county. Yeah. By the way, that's what downtown Forest looked like during the war. But when we lose our heads like that, sometimes we forget the things that are really important and the people who are really important. And this was one of the people that was very important to our community. His name was Doyle McAdams. That's him right there with his uncle, who was a gentleman who taught for 50 years in Forest. Very well-loved gentleman. That was their favorite picture. Both of them had that at home. There was a great affection between him and his uncle. And this is him with his students at Liberty over in Warren Township. He was very beloved. He was drafted. He went overseas. He never saw fighting. He caught the flu, the Spanish influenza, and died in France in October the 5th, 1918. And his funeral was held on the porch of his uncle there in the town of Forest, and they said it was probably the most emotional one that had ever taken place. And so all the negativity just seemed to evaporate because people began to realize what was important. I used to ask my students in history time, they took a big ball of cockaburras while he was in getting a haircut, slid it under the saddle, and when he sat down on the saddle, heck, went about 10, 15 feet in the air, but he came up fighting, and about 10 boys, about 10 years old, went all over town, running for their lives, as well as they should have been. Then, of course, the famous 1936 forced dance hall fight. Oh, that was, heard a lot about this one. Group of Italians from Kokomo decided that they were going to come to Forest and take over the dance hall and have their own dance. Unfortunately, it turned into a big brawl. One in which a gentleman by the name of Slick Young hit a guy who was about 6'10", down a stairway, broke his hand. Fortunately for Forrest, there were a few guys who were Golden Glove boxers. It just became insane. But basically, the Italians loaded everybody up, decided, this wasn't a friendly town, and they went back to Kokomo. Okay. Pluto water. Okay, Alva promised to the people involved in this, there will be no names. Anyway, how many have heard of Pluto water? Oh, yes, absolutely. One of the miracles of French Lick, Indiana. Mineral water. And it was used for improving your health. I don't know, is that what it was for? That's what they said. I don't see how. But anyway, one of the young gentlemen who thought he was moving up in the world was dating sort of the belle of the community. And he already had plans on how he was going to marry her, and already had eyes on her father's farm, and all kinds of things. And his friends, I guess you call them friends, you know how young men can be, had taken a bottle of 7-Up. And what they did was they poured out some of the 7-Up, poured some cool water and mixed it up. Okay. Before he went off on his big date, they said, well, hey, let's drink to your future marriage. And so he, being excited and everything, just swigged it down. Well, sure enough, about an hour or so later, here comes this young man in his fancy buggy. He had his best buggy. Forrest was all groomed, and he's driving through downtown Forest when certain biological urges hit him, and because of the powers of the Pluto water, and he made quite a scene in the middle of the town. He did not marry the young woman. She had, as a matter of fact, she had somebody else take her home, and the young man actually remained a bachelor the rest of his life. But with friends like that, who needs enemies, right? There's another story during the war years. I'm down to 5 minutes. I probably get going. I'll skip those two and save them for another day. Wanted to put these 4 gentlemen up. These are the 4 gentlemen that we lost during the Second World War from our community. Herb Jordan, Lewis Abbott, Donald Dale Orem, and Ernie Flickinger. On the home front, there's all kinds of stories locally during the war. One of our local merchants, Clint Burns, everything was rationed during World War II. Sugar, tires, flour, all kinds of things were rationed. And lo and behold, anyway, a young lady and her young daughter, they got their ration stamps and everything. And so Clint says, wow, that's a lot of sugar. Mommy's going to be making a lot of cookies. And the little girl, who was probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5, says, oh, that's nothing. You ought to see the sugar under Mommy's bed. People were buying off the black market what they couldn't get, with their food stamps. Troop trains would go through town, and when they did, everybody would turn out, with flags. They'd go up, and they'd wave to the troops as they, the trains went through town. This was part of it. Then, of course, we had the story of a lady. She was an older lady, wore high top collars, button boots. Her husband had been a colonel during the Spanish-American War, and she still didn't have electricity, didn't believe in it, and they used to have blackouts. And so when they had the blackout, you were supposed to turn your lights out, so that way, the plane couldn't spot where to drop a bomb. Well, Lily refused. It's like, hey, my husband, he served in the U.S. Army. Hey, I'm not doing anything any government in Washington tells me. So the local guys who were in charge of the blackout said, okay, what do we do? So they called Frankfort, and Frankfort calls Indianapolis, Indianapolis calls Washington, and a telegram from Washington, D.C. comes to Forest, Indiana, and says, shoot her lights out. Fortunately, people, of course, have a little more common sense than that, and actually the gentleman in charge of that was a good friend of mine, Paul Milligan, and he said, we looked at that and we said, but if we shoot her lights out, we'll burn down half the town. So Lily Bridges got to keep her lights on. Gladys Cherie was involved in the Red Cross, and she helped a lot of people in the community during the Second World War. We had our versions of Rosie the Riveter. There were a lot of wonderful women that went off and worked in factories. DJ Day celebrations. I guess I think of one in particular. One person told me, and when he told me this, it was with tears in his eyes. When I was interviewing him for my book and stuff, he was asked if he wanted to go to the big celebration in Kokomo, and he said no. He had lost his best friend during the war, and had several others that were wounded, and no, he didn't want to go there. So this was a tough time for our community here in Clinton County and in Forest. I'm down to 3 minutes. Local government in the 1950s. Mr. Borders and his grocery store in the 50s. This is something, the beauty of community, helping each other. That's what Forest was always about. That's why I named my book Out of the Spirit and the Soil. Because out of the spirit. These are local farmers helping Ralph and Leela Myers harvest his farm after he had a heart attack. That's what it's about. Volunteerism. The local fire department in 1965, people working together in the community. But the generation that built the town, the generation that saw its heyday, began passing away in the 1960s. And eventually our community has lost all its business, much of its population, and its being as a self-reliant agrarian community. There's an interesting lady, Bee Donner. She collected light and phone bills for over 70 years. That's an accomplishment. And she never missed a penny. Okay? Oh, in the background? Are you back there?
No, I'm looking to gas stations.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, good old Duke Scott. And I have not checked. This has got to be a record for Indiana, maybe not the nation. He worked on the election board for 74 years. That's got to be a record, I think. But a very jovial, good-natured gentleman, and always kept you laughing. Forest Post Office, which is our only business left, back in 1988. The end of the large business building, the Forest Block, in 1988. That's myself and my son reenacting, I guess, the coming of Thomas and Joseph Nutter in 1839. And with 1 minute left, like I said, my mentor in a lot of this was Dr. Swayze. He once said, and I guess this is one of the reasons my community's always held a very wonderful place in my heart. Cleon said, here was a man who went on, became involved in national politics, academia. He was head of the economics department at Columbia for years. And he always said he started every class with stories of Luke McAdams and his teachers and his neighbors in Force. And these are people who went on to become major captains of industry. And he said at night, he would still, even as he, was in his 80s, he dreamt of downtown Force. He dreamt of Force. And so Force was always in his heart and in his dreams. So.
You spoke of the Myers.
Pardon me?
The Myers who had a heart attack and they joined together.
I got multiple hearings, she knows.
Is that relation to the Myers that was the music teacher then in there?
Yes,
Not Leland.
that is her.
It was Leland.
That is her. Yeah, you want me to go back and see what she looked like when she was younger.
Mean as ever, probably.
That
was Bob Eller at the post office, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's Leland right there.
Right
Yeah,
there.
that's her. Yeah. So, questions? Hey, nobody threw any vegetables on there. Pardon me, sir? That I don't know.
Myerson?
Yeah, where was the farm?
Right across from the schoolyard there.
Yeah, I knew when they moved into town, but I'm not sure where he farmed. It was in Forest Township.
I'm not sure that they owned the farm, but he farmed.
He may have rented. That's possible.
I think so.
Yeah. So.
What school was down from where I used to live? Was that Possum Trot School?
Possum Trot? Possum Trot was out there.
Everybody did a
Evaluation.
Out there near where Perry Bell Cook and Lenson's lived. It was out in the Lenson area.
What school would have been down from where I lived? Little Flock. Little Flock?
Oh, Little Flock was a church. That was a church.
Where Becky lived, wasn't it?
Huh?
It was right down on the corner there from her.
Oh, there was.
Little Flock.
Oh, there was. Okay, yeah.
Like between the corner and where I originally lived, there was I assume it was a school. It wasn't a church? It was a church. Church.
Yeah, Little Flock Baptist. It was Missionary Baptist. Actually, what it was, the only instrument allowed in the building was a tuning fork, and they were only allowed to sing one hymn every Sunday. So, yes, sir.
The forest that we're talking about today, is this the forest, the location of the forest?
Indiana. Yeah.
I mean, it is the same location today as 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the peak population over this period of the last 150 years? Do you have any estimate of what?
About 1920. At that time, the population was just a little over 800. Yeah, I believe it was 812, if I recall. So, yeah. So the heyday, it really came then. And, of course, there's always the question is what brought about the demise? And obviously, technology. I mean, just like, the stirrup and the longbow ended the Middle Ages. I mean, that ended knights in armor. They became obsolete. What really, I think, probably brought it about, Grace Ogle, she always said it was the lack, when the train quit running. Cleon Swayze always said it was the invention of the automobile. And they started paving roads, getting better roads. You could get from here to there quicker. People started going to Frankfort. They started going to Kokomo. So you didn't support your local merchants. So if there was a true villain in the demise of communities like Forest, it was probably the Model T. Yeah.
There were two grocery stores, an implement store, two two gas stations.
There was more than that in the 20s, yeah.
That's the ones I saw.
Yeah. Jewelry store,
There was a door.
well, that was in the 20s.
Parlor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, jewelry store, opera house, 2 hotels, probably 4 restaurants, 2 creameries, a coal company, yeah, what? Oh, and of course, funeral home, yeah, for a long, long time, yeah.
And the only thing that's left is the hotel.
That's it,
And it's our God.
that's it, yeah.
How about the loss of the impact of the loss of their school? Was
I
it
think
back
that
about-
always plays a part in maybe a lack in identity, but I'm not sure if that, it will play a certain factor in the economics of it, but I don't think it's the deciding factor in the economic demise. You know, the school was there in the 1950s, yeah, but if you really truly look at everything, you know, all the statistics and, you know, you look at the information, the town was going down even then. It just didn't seem like it with the school there, because you still had that sense of identity. True. And he sold the first TVs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All the little towns died out there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Finished.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, you know, and it's not only Clinton County, I think that's across the United States.
Here.
Yeah.
Frankfort.
Yeah, very much so.
Your downtown compared to 30 years ago.
Yeah, there's a picture book a professor that I met did. It's called Wisconsin Death Trip, and it's about rural America, you know, and how basically this process began, you know, during that time period when the automobile first came about, and as it became more prominent. And we began to McDonaldize America too. You know, you had, instead of a mom and pop restaurant or a mom and pop hotel, you had McDonald's, you had Holiday Inn. So it was sort of the way of America. But whenever I get a chance, if I see a mom and pop establishment, I always try to support them.
What was the last name of Bronco that was in
Stoddard.
Ranger?
Stotter. Yeah.
There's some Stoddard's buried out.
Regina Davis was his sister.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was also one of the stars of the 1909 Indiana University basketball team. He was a starter for the Hoosiers in 1909. I thought you'd like that. Yeah. You got to support those Hoosiers.
Have you been to the Mayberry Diner?
Pardon me?
Have you been to the Mayberry Diner?
No, I've heard about it in Danville.
That's my home.
Yes. You been to that one?
I'm from Danville.
Oh,
I live
fantastic.
in Fort now, but that's my
All right.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Just have Mayberry Festival. Yeah,
Well, I will have to. I will try to make it there.
bring that this year. The first year for it, so.
Okay.
Andy, could I have the floor for just a minute?
Sure, absolutely.
I would like to tell these folks, and most of them probably don't realize this. St. Paul Cemetery is located in Forest Township, and there's a newer part of the cemetery on one side of Road 400 North, and then an older part where there's no longer, I don't think, any burials there. Is there?
No, the last person buried there was Esther Mendenhall in 1987.
Okay. On the north side, there's still burials that take place, but that south side was kind of built on a hill. And in the 1800s, we didn't put foundation so much under the stones, and so many of the stones had fallen over through the years and washed, of course, so that you could no longer even read who buried there. Mr. Robertson here took a lot of time, and I have how long, Andy?
With our board, too. Dick Wiring and Becky here.
A lot of people, but you were the director of the board of seeing that cemetery was preserved. And we It's really nice. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Really great. Just fine.
So we still have community pride out there, we're still working at it.
Did you get a grant to help with that, Andy?
Am I in trouble? I know I talked too long.
We'll take care of this. We'll watch for you.
Did you get a grant to help pay for any of
No,
that?
no, that is
did.
all from local people donating and supporting that,
But it was all your time and effort.
along with the other board members,
Right.
yeah. Joan Smith, Becky McQuinn,
And
Dick Wyrick,
all the board.
and Bev Epley. Yeah,
And you were very grateful for that.
we try to preserve what we got.
And I think are you the caretaker of the cemetery now?
Yeah, she broke me into it.
I
Here, sign this.